Hello everyone, my name is Colosseum, but you may call me Robbie for short, and today I'm rating all the Pokemon teams I've had throughout most of my years playing Pokemon. Every time I start a new playthrough, I try to choose my team of 6 Pokemon with different types. For some reason, Pokémon Home says I caught certain Pokemon in 2014, which is not true because I've been playing Pokemon probably since 2002. Anyway, I'm gonna go through each of my Pokemon teams and give them a rating on a scale of 1 to 10. This completely subjective rating will depend on how helpful the team was as a whole, the type variety across all 6 Pokemon, and probably some nostalgia factor. Now without further ado, let's start with my first playthrough of Pokemon Pearl. That team consisted of an overleveled Empoleon that knew Surf, a Staraptor that knew Fly and Defog, and a Bibarel that I used to teach the remaining 4 HMs. That's it. That's the entire team. I also had a Chatot that I got from an NPC because the DS had a feature where you could teach Chatot to repeat literally anything you said. 10 out of 10. Shortly after, I graduated middle school and a new generation of Pokemon was released. I was no longer a silly kid who used the starter to beat the entire game. No, I was a true Pokemon trainer. My team for Pokemon Black consisted of my starter Samurott, Unfezant, Stoutland, Simisear, Archeops, and Zebstrika. Apparently this team is from 2011, which means I was in high school, so I knew the basics of battle mechanics like type matchups, abilities, and held items. But I still had that childhood mindset of offensive moves only, no status moves whatsoever. This is precisely the team I'd expect from earlier generations. I typically stick to early Pokemon so I wouldn't have to grind for levels later on. We always needed a flying type in these earlier games, so Unfezant's purpose was to learn Fly since Archeops couldn't. Archeops has an awesome design, but it was a pain in battles because of its ability to Fetus, which I've talked about before on my channel, and Simisear would end up getting replaced by Reshiram because of its overlapping fire type. Samurott and Zebstrika were standouts, as they typically did the most damage, but it's really not my best team. 5 out of 10. 3 years later, I did a second playthrough of Pokemon Black because I felt that I didn't remember much of the story. This time, my team consisted of Kelvin the Emvor, Seismitoad, Sigilyph, Vanillux, Ferrothorn, and Eelektross. I opted for Emvor to switch it up since I chose Samurott the first time. Before starting this new playthrough though, I definitely planned to have a balanced team that could also hold all the HMs I needed. Half of my team has almost no weaknesses, one of which has none because Eelektross' ability is Levitate. This team was definitely stacked with some great Pokemon, some of which are my favorites from this generation. 9 out of 10. We move on to the 6th generation with Pokemon X. My team here consisted of Greninja, Blaziken, Florges, Lucario, Helios the Charizard, and Talonflame, which is chilling in my save file for Pokemon X. When I thought of this video idea, this was one of the first teams I thought of. This team has barely any variety in terms of type matchups, and I remember I had the hardest time with Seabold in the Pokemon League. Of course I did! There's 3 fire types on my team! Why? I'm pretty sure I got trigger happy by spamming Mega Evolution on either the Lucario you get from the Fighting Gym Leader, the Charizard you get from Professor Sycamore, or the Blaziken with Speed Boost that you got from the Mystery Gift. I think about this team sometimes, and I'm definitely disappointed every time. 4 out of 10. Next we have Pokemon OmegaRuby. Hoenn is my favorite region of Pokemon, so I remember the many playthroughs and memories I have from that generation. Before the game released, they announced a couple of mystery gifts. A shiny Beldum that was available to everyone, and a shiny Gengar that you could receive with a code from GameStop for Pokemon X and Y. Coming into this remake with ample experience in the Hoenn region, I thought it would be fun to have a team of 1 Pokemon from each generation since we were in the 6th generation. There aren't many Pokemon from Generation 2 that I enjoy though, so I kept the idea but sacrificed the Johtomon for the shiny Metagross, which has a different motif. This will be important in a minute. The team consisted of Skipper the Swampert, the shiny mystery gift Metagross, the shiny Gengar you got from GameStop, Abomasnow, Galvantula, and Noivern. Obviously you can't get half of these until you obtain the National Dex, which is after beating the main story. What I did was breed them so I could get a level 1 offspring of each Pokemon and brought them to OmegaRuby from X using Pokemon Bank. That was a mistake. Turns out having traded Pokemon makes the gameplay even easier because you'll eventually be way over leveled. How did I not realize this? And I knew this information, but it somehow didn't click until halfway through the game. And at that point, it was already too late. 3 out of 10. Then we have the 7th generation with Pokemon Moon. This was the first generation where I really committed to naming all of my playthrough Pokemon. This team consisted of Ariel, the Primarina, Wendell, the Lycanroc, Melanie, the Vikavolt, Slatheria, the Salazzle, Anchorman, the Delmise, and Balboa, the Crabominable. This region was based on Hawaii, so I was very excited for all the new tropical Pokemon because I'm from the Caribbean, obviously, and all I know is tropical weather. I remember Salazzle being a standout on my team because of how fast it was in battle and its ability to poison steel and poison types with corrosion. Crabominable, unfortunately, wasn't as useful as I wanted it to be. It's only able to evolve on top of Mount Lanakila, which you can't access until just before the Pokemon League, and it has a whopping 6 weaknesses. That's so bad. Delmise was also a late game addition that took a long time to get because it has a 1% encounter rate from this one fishing spot in Seafolk Village. Overall, this team has some of my favorite Pokemon designs from this generation, but they unfortunately don't complement each other all that well. 7 out of 10. The next game I played was Ultra Sun because I was on a mission to catch all 809 Pokemon available at the time, and I needed Solgaleo to complete my living dex. Since I started naming my Pokemon last time, this time around I decided on a theme for the nicknames. My team for this playthrough consisted of Neon the Decidueye, Helium the Toucanon, Hydrogen the Araquanid, Boron the Passimian, Sulfur the Turtonator, and Iodine the Alolan Ninetales. I also have to give a shout out to Magnesium the Lycanroc, who I got as a mystery gift, but ended up replacing to avoid the same situation as with Generation 6. My experience was about the same, considering it's more of a sequel to the last one than a remake of another game. Decidueye was especially helpful during the battle against Ultra Necrozma, which I've talked about in a previous video. Necrozma has a base stat total of 754? Not even Arceus, the Pokemon God, has this high of a stat total. This was a solid team overall throughout my entire playthrough, and more easily obtainable this time. The team is also pretty balanced and they complement each other very well. It really made me appreciate this generation's Pokemon a lot more. 8 out of 10. To close out this generation of games, we have Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. My team could only consist of Generation 1 Pokemon, which was refreshing for me because I grew up with the Hoenn games on the Game Boy. Eevee was my obligatory starter Pokemon. The rest of my team was comprised of Charizard, Venusaur, Gyarados, Gengar, and Alolan Ninetales. As you can probably tell, I love Alolan Ninetales. It's almost like I'm gay or something. I don't remember my Pokemon team from Fire Red at all, but I do remember that my starter was Blastoise, so I didn't want to use Blastoise again. Charizard was an easy addition because it's given to you by an NPC after catching a certain amount of Pokemon. Venusaur was the same, and since I almost never chose the grass starters, it was an opportunity to try it out. I've also always liked Gyarados, which was perfect to complete that Fire, Water, Grass core. This team was pretty balanced, and it was helpful to have a Fairy type on the team that could handle Lance's multiple Dragonite, which brings me to my next point. Let's Go Eevee, unfortunately, wasn't all that challenging for me because there weren't any abilities to worry about, and Partner Eevee is objectively stronger than a regular Eevee, so I barely have any memorable moments with this team, but they get some bonus points for rideability. It was so nice to ride on the back of a Charizard, and the fact that you can also ride on Gengar's back was a cherry on top. 7 out of 10. Moving to Generation 8, we have a couple of games to talk about. Let's start with Pokemon Sword, which is the first game where I tried to building a team while avoiding spoilers for Pokemon designs. My team consisted of Cry the Inteleon, Rockefeller the Toxtricity, Iroh the Centiskorch, RuneScape the Runerigus, Marshall Lee the Grimmsnarl, and Duracell the Duraludon. For a team built blind from any prior knowledge of the types and movesets, I have to say, I think I did a pretty good job. I still looked up how to evolve some of them, Runerigus, because I would have never figured it out by myself. Inteleon was of course a standout on my team with its high special attack and speed stats, but I especially loved having Runerigus and Grimmsnarl on the team. Runerigus I loved for its unique typing and ability, Wandering Spirit, which switches abilities with the opponent if Runerigus is hit by a move that makes contact. Grimmsnarl, on the other hand, has Prankster, which gives priority to status moves, like Thunder Wave and Baby Doll Eyes, both moves that were very helpful against Leon's quick and hard-hitting team. This is one of the most solid and balanced teams I've built for a regular playthrough, and I would absolutely use them again. 9 out of 10. Now, with Pokemon Shield, I wasn't as successful. Whenever I do a second playthrough, in this case on a different version, I try to build a team with Pokemon completely different from my first time. My team here consisted of Ronaldo the Cinderace, Nova the Orbeetle, Smith the Appleton, Ringo the Obstagoon, Milady the Galarian Weezing, and Shivers the Arctozolt. I don't know what it is about Sword and Shield, but I found myself slightly underleveled most of the time. Every time I walked into a battle against the gym leader, my team was generally 1 or 2 levels below the gym leader's ace. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the challenge, but 2 of my Pokemon, Appleton and Orbeetle, have 6 weaknesses each, one of which is a 4 times weakness to Ice on Appleton's part. And Archer's ult is too slow to do most anything in battle. This meant that Cinderace would be left to pick up the slack a lot of the time because of its very high speed. Galarian Weezing though was a standout on Raihan's gym because of its ability neutralizing gas, which negates all other abilities on the field. I didn't realize how significantly easier this would make battles against Raihan until I reached that gym challenge, because it meant Raihan wouldn't be able to set up immediate weather effects with his Gigalith Sandstream. This team was not the most balanced overall, and it was a little frustrating to have the same Pokemon faint over and over again. 7 out of 10. Pokemon Shining Pearl! We all know that it was the most terrible remake of any Pokemon game, but let's focus on the fun parts. My team consisted of King the Empoleon, Ione the Luxray, Airhead the Drifblim, Gloria the Hippowdon, Percival the Gallade, and Cory the Weavile. An overall balanced team, if you ask me, but I had a couple of issues just obtaining the members alone. I focused so much on using Pokemon that I'd never used before on a playthrough that I didn't account for this game being a 1-for-1 remake of the original Diamond and Pearl games. This meant that I had to wait until an actual Friday to get a Drifloon for my team, hunt for a 5% chance of encountering a Hippopotas in the Ruined Maniac Cave, scour the underground for a male Ralt, and subsequently loot Mount Coronet for a Dawnstone to evolve Kirlia. I don't think I've ever felt so frustrated playing a Pokemon game during a regular playthrough like I did with Shining Pearl. And honestly, I did this to myself. But this team was worth a struggle in the end because of how useful they were during the story. Drifblim and Gallade were standouts for their versatile movesets. Drifblim in particular because of this unique recovery move that I hadn't heard about until this game. Strength Sap recovers the user's health by lowering the target's attack stat, which was amazing for Drifblim because of its poor defense. Hippowdon was mostly helpful for setting up Sandstorm to slowly chip away damage while withstanding hits with its bulky stats so that Empoleon could later switch in to sweep opponents. Shout out to this Empoleon for toughing out Garchomp's Earthquake so that I wouldn't feel sad, and winning this battle with one final Ice Beam. Weavile, on the other hand, was rough. Regardless, this is still a great team. If only they were less tricky to acquire. 7 out of 10. To close out this generation, we have the best Pokemon game I've played in recent years, Pokemon Legends Arceus. Since there were only a handful of new species and forms introduced, I focused on choosing Pokemon from that selection of new designs and Pokemon I'd never used before on any kind of playthrough. My team consisted of Quill, the Hisuian Decidueye, Bo, the Sylveon, Gambit, the Hisuian Zoroark, Dex, the Luxray, Goober, the Hisuian Goodra, and Fang, the Walrein. I chose this team with 0 spoilers, and let me tell you, this is the best team I have ever played with. Sylveon is my second favorite Pokemon, just behind Ditto, so I really wanted to use it on a playthrough team. We talked earlier about my Kalos team and how it was pretty bad. Sylveon was introduced in the Kalos region, so it felt like a good time to use a Kalos Pokemon. It's probably the same reason why I chose Goodra. Plus, I almost never have pseudo-legendaries on my team. Hisuian Goodra was an excellent choice because of its Dragon and Steel typing, and its very high special defense allowed it to withstand a lot of damage. Luxray at this point felt like a tired choice because it's been on practically every Sinnoh team out there. I could have easily used an Electivire instead, but Luxray ended up being so useful that I decided to keep it. Thunder Wave was such a big help. Walrein was a late game addition that served as coverage for the other Pokemon on my team, like Hisuian Decidueye, whose 4 times weakness to flying absolutely needed to be covered. Speaking of Decidueye, its signature move Triple Arrows became essential in battle. With its increased movement speed when using Triple Arrows in Agile style, I was sometimes able to move twice in a row, a strategy that was important during that final Volo battle. This is where Hisuian Zoroark came in very handy. Its normal and ghost typing meant it was immune to Giratina's ghost type attacks, with Shadow Sneak's increased priority when used in an agile style. In conjunction with Bitter Malice and Zoroark's high speed, it allowed me to attack 5 times in a row without interruption. Every member pulled an equal amount of weight throughout the entire playthrough, but Zoroark was the definite MVP. 10 out of 10. Before we talk about my team for Scarlet and Violet, I want to show you some of my partner Pokemon that I found from the early games. I have a Blastoise I mentioned earlier all the way from Pokemon Fire Red. There's Pokemon from Heart Gold that I remember transferring just so I could get Suicune to complete my Pokédex. My Swampert from Pokemon Emerald only has Mudshot because I had to remove all the HMs in order to transfer it. Then there's my starters from Pokemon Colosseum. Look at them, they're beautiful. In that game, you always start with Espeon and Umbreon, which is why before Sylveon, Espeon was my favorite evolution. I was attached to this one. Espeon was always my highest level Pokemon, therefore it was always my hardest hitter. Umbreon was also good in certain situations. I hadn't realized that at the time, but Umbreon is bulky, so it was capable of taking hits. Umbreon and Espeon work really well together in double battles. I would chip away small chunks of damage with Umbreon and finish them off with Espeon. Finally, we finished the video with Pokémon Violet. My most recent team consisted of Enrique the Quaquaval, Perry the Clodsire, Fortuna the Cerulege, Voltaire the Kilowattrel, Marley the Tinkachan, and Candelabra the Espathra. Quaquaval quickly became one of my favorites for its energetic and queer-coded animations. Clodsire was my hazard setter, which I realize isn't the ideal role for it because it has abysmal speed. Tinkachan was probably my most defensively inclined Pokemon since I gave it an Assault Vest to boost its already high special defense, and Gigaton Hammer was an instantly a favorite move, even if Tinkachan doesn't have the best attack stat. Espathra and Kilowattrel performed as well as you'd expect for speedy Pokemon with high special attack. But the real MVP was Cerulege, with its signature move Bitter Blade, which I think has the most relatable description of any Pokemon move. The user focuses its bitter feelings toward the world of the living into a slashing attack. If that doesn't describe millennials and Gen Z to a T, I don't know what does. I slapped a big root on Cerulege to increase the amount of HP it receives by 30%, and the rest was history. This is a solid team for sure. It's very balanced defensively and can offensively cover every single type, and each Pokemon was a standout in its own right. 8 out of 10. Those are all my partner Pokemon I could find on Pokémon Home. My first game was Pokémon Crystal, but I never finished it because I lost the Game Boy with the game in it. So my true first was Pokémon Emerald, which I played multiple times, so I don't remember what my team was except for Swampert because it's the best Hoenn starter, period. But it was fun to revisit my childhood, and I hope it inspires the newer generation to visit the earlier games because those Pokemon games are also a lot of fun. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and as always, I appreciate you being here. Bye!